Mr. Thomas, how you doing?
I'm great. Will, how are you?
Good. It's late on a Friday, so I could be better, but I'll have a drink after work. Caroline, what's going on with you?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm also looking forward to that drink.
Nice. Well, Thomas, in particular, appreciate you joining us to chat through OGMP 2.0. When Caroline and I were catching up on this topic, we thought it would be very pertinent because obviously it's designed to be flexible, which is great. That also leads to a lot of confusion around what it is and what it isn't. Highwood in particular is, I think, probably best positioned both in terms of what you do and the knowledge that you have to speak about OGMP 2.0. So I guess before we jump in and kind of get into all the minutia, tell us a little bit about what Highwood is doing in the emission space or the OGMP 2.0 space and kind of how that positions you well to speak about this today.
Yeah, no, happy to. So OGMP has kind of taken off for us and has quickly become kind of one of our largest areas of focus and opportunity. We started Highwood, about 4 years ago. We were doing a lot of technology evaluation and technology strategy for oil and gas companies. And then we put out this kind of voluntary initiatives report because there's all these different voluntary initiatives and people were confused about certifications versus reporting and on all of this different stuff. And through that, we started to kind of become experts in measurement informed inventories, in collecting different types of company specific data and then weaving that data together for reporting. We participated in developing the Veritas protocols as well. And as you know, the third pathway in the Veritas protocol is intended to be OGMP aligned and harmonized so that companies can check multiple boxes at once when they build these types of inventories. So right now we work with a number of companies on OGMP, more typically on the later levels with the more kind of complex data analysis work around reconciliation and estimating uncertainties on inventories, which we'll get into. We've been doing it from a consulting perspective for quite a few years now, and we actually just launched a new product last week called EIP, which you can think of as a TurboTax for OGMP reporting. Basically takes all of this complexity and allows you to plug in your data and achieve the gold standard in a matter of minutes if you're all ready to go on the data front. So we've done a lot of work to take these, as you kind of alluded to, these vague principles based requirements and guidance and make them much more specific and develop workflows around them.
Yeah, huge congrats on getting that done. I remember we had breakfast with feels like well over a year ago now, and you were going through some of the early growing pains of building software. It's different. It's different than consulting reports. And then Caroline,
Lots of
obviously,
pain.
yeah, you work with me here at Canary. So for those people who are just tuning in, Will Foyle's co-founder. It's here at Project Canary, I should say. Thomas Fox, president and co-founder of Highwood Emissions, and then Caroline, introduce yourself.
Yes, Caroline Dunn. I'm our Chief Operating Officer here at Project Canary, and it's kind of great to hear, Thomas, how you actually found yourself in the OGMP 2.0 space. I feel like we've kind of come at it from a totally different direction where we were really early stage working on continuous monitoring. We then expanded that measurement portfolio to help operators really bring together their continuous monitoring data, their intermittent data, that's flyovers, satellites, OGI inspections. And now we're actually working on the bottom up inventory side. So looking at those greenhouse gas accounting platforms, which then the marriage of those two data sets is where you start to enter a world of OGMP 2.0. And so we now have customers that are asking us, hey, we're using this measurement. How could we use it for some of these voluntary initiatives? So it's always fun to hear the origin story of how you get from point A to point B.
I'm so glad we're having this conversation because we don't do bottom-up inventories or technology deployment, and we definitely haven't tried to do too much in this space. So there's lots of room for collaboration and having this conversation.
You know where I've been for a while when you say collaboration. I think I've said it for 3 years now. There's no silver bullet as it relates to measurement technology or approach. It's all a set of trade-offs. But I think we're getting a little bit of ahead of ourselves if kind of a layman listener is here. I guess taking a step back, like what is OGMP 2.0? How did it come about? What's the purpose? And I guess like what is it being utilized for? Because this is not a government kind of approach, really. Well, it depends if you classify the UN as a government entity. But
Mhm.
right, can you help us understand this, Thomas? Like, what actually is this?
Yeah, so the OGMP 2.0 is a voluntary, we like to call it a reporting framework from the United Nations Environment Program. There are about roughly 150, maybe just shy of 150 oil and gas companies all around the world who have signed up to OGMP 2.0 to basically join this methane emissions reporting journey, striving for kind of international standardization and consistency and credibility. And these companies are basically embarking upon a multi-year process where OGMP is really, as we kind of alluded to before, it's principles based. It's designed to help operators learn more about where their emissions are coming from and how much they're emitting from different sources. And the goal of OGMP is really to help operators mitigate, reduce emissions. So when you join OGMP, you set a target based on the information you have at that time. It can be an absolute emissions reduction target or an intensity-based target. And then you kind of enter onto the staircase of gradually improving your methane reporting year over year. There's an expectation for companies who are joining OGMP that they're going to reach what is called the gold standard of reporting after 3 years of participating in OGMP. But there are 5 levels. And so people get a little bit confused because there's a gold standard and then there's all these levels. But you can think of the levels kind of broadly as level 1, you just report one very generic estimate for your entire company. Level 2, you have some really simple source categories that you report a generic estimate for. Level 3 is where most companies start because there's an expectation that you at least attempt level 5 by year 3. And so in level 3, you have more specific source categories, but you are still allowed to use generic estimates for all of them. And so you can think of level 3 as kind of the old version of EPA sub-RW reporting before they made all of the changes. When you move to level 4, that's when things start to get tricky because the idea within OGMP is that you're using company-specific data. And so in level 4, you're going to start moving from these generic estimates on your source category resolved emissions to company-specific estimates. And so that involves collecting data on kind of your activities, so what counts of equipment you have, different types of emitting equipment, but also developing company-specific emissions factors. So that means I'm going to go out and source by source, whether it's for flare destruction efficiency or pneumatic bleed rates or fugitive emission rates for threaded connections and valves. I'm going to take measurements of those emission sources, and I'm going to use those measurements to derive emissions factors that are specific to my company that I can propagate across my assets. Level 5 is where you are actually going to corroborate those types of measurements with different types of measurements. And typically these are called site level measurements, but in practice they can also be equipment level measurements. But effectively what you're doing is you're using top-down measurements from a technology like an aircraft or a drone or potentially continuous monitoring or satellites. Although there's some nuance there depending on what technology, what's currently permitted. And you take those measurements and you compare them to your source level measurement informed inventory to determine whether or not you're on the right track and whether there's some huge discrepancies that you should be aware of that might indicate that you're missing something in your inventory. And so once you've gotten to level 4, where you have the source level inventory and you're starting to attempt level 5 with some site level measurements, that's what UNEP currently defines as the gold standard. True level 5 is when you're really deploying. True level 5, if you're purely level 5, is even better than the gold standard because you're deploying site level measurement technologies everywhere, at least in a representative manner. And you're performing these reconciliations where you're comparing and potentially even updating your estimates to get closer to the truth.
There's so much in there. By the way, I forgot about that you have to set a company specific target and year over year reductions. That is actually something that I forgot about. And there is a clock on it. I think you said it's 3 years to get to level 5. Is that roughly correct?
3 years to get to the gold standard, which is an attempt at level 5 as currently defined.
An attempt at level 5.
Yeah, so for a while, UNEP was defining it as level 4 and then level 5 at 1/3 of assets. But I believe that definition has been relaxed this year to just a general attempt. But that specific definition is evolving.
Okay, we'll get into this whole evolution piece, and this is something that Caroline in particular likes to touch on. I'm going to try to paraphrase this really fast to see. Level one would be if you just assumed a certain amount of methane per barrel of oil or gas, or unit of gas produced. Level two would be if you just said, "Hey, I'm going to have an emission factor for the flares and the tanks and kind of an everything else bucket." Level three would be traditional subpart W, reporting things like heaters, pneumatic devices, blowdowns, both equipment and activity. And then level four, you'd actually go out to things like a pneumatic device and put a high flow sampler on it and sample different pieces of equipment across your facility and come up with your own pneumatic factor, your own pressure release valve factor, or whatever it may be. And then five, you're going to compare flyover data, statistically represented flyover data versus what you're seeing on what I just described in level four. Where did I mess that up?
You pretty much nailed it. Level five is compare and potentially combine into a reconciled estimate that potentially uses the best information from either approach. And then level five also, in order to perform that comparison, you have to do some kind of uncomfortable and complex uncertainty analysis, which isn't necessarily required in level four because you're comparing apples to oranges in level five. And so you're never going to get exactly the same number in both. And so you need some confidence interval on both estimates in order to know whether you're within a reasonable range.
Yeah, makes sense. It's when you get to level five that I start losing track of all the rules. Attempt to do level
Yeah.
five. I'm like, okay, got it.
There's a lot of thou shalt and thou should
Yeah,
consider.
it's the intention that counts. Caroline, I guess one thing I've heard you talk about quite a bit is some of the conversations you've had about, moving from level three to level five. And I think you've highlighted that some folks are very advanced in what it is that they know and the path that they're on, and others not so much. And I guess, can you touch a little bit about what you've seen in terms of the divergence or the disparity and how people perceive that journey? And then interested to hear from you as well, Thomas.
Absolutely. Well, and this is why it's fun to do this with Thomas, is because we come at this from very different perspectives. Whereas, like, a lot of times we're talking to operators that are using measurement, and then they're like, "Hey, what's this OGMP 2.0 thing? How hard is it for me to get from level three to level five?" Whereas I think Thomas is mostly working with folks who are like, "I've signed up. Like, you're going to help me get there." So it's a pretty interesting perspective that I think we can both bring to it. Thomas did a great job of describing this. Is level three, if you're a U.S. operator, you're effectively there, and so getting that level three inventory in place, that isn't too much of a challenge for folks. But I think when it comes to then updating emission factors or doing some in-field source measurements, there can be a disconnect in terms of like, what's the level of effort does that look like? What is the statistically representative set of measurements that I ultimately need to do? Asking those sorts of questions. And I also find that particularly when you're going from level four, which is updating those source specific calculations, to level five, which, like you said, Thomas, it can sometimes be apples to oranges. I often find that operators really struggle with going from a spreadsheet into measurement data and how you compare those two worlds. So that's what we have those conversations a lot with operators, which is you're managing multiple sets of books. How do you effectively start to compare your measurement data to that bottom up inventory? And it kind of comes down to managing a different level of data complexity than I think a lot of operators are used to. But again, we're typically talking to folks that are exploring OGMP 2.0 versus really executing on a plan that they have already put in place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are great points, and I completely agree. One of the things that we see, I'll just touch on a couple of things that operators, in our experience, tend to encounter as they kind of progress through the levels. One is that materiality of categories tends to change as you start measuring, which means you kind of have to start over and over and over it again. So a good example is in the old subpart W reporting methodology. A typical company in the Permian might expect 75% of their emissions to come from pneumatic devices. But once you get to a level five, it could be that 90% are coming from flares or tanks. And that is a very common shift. And so if you are invested in and expecting all of your emissions to be coming from pneumatics, it's a bit of a rude awakening. And so that's kind of the composition shift or paradigm that the companies need to kind of get over. Another one that can be uncomfortable is that emissions tend to be higher when you start measuring at the site level. And that's purely because the bottom-up inventories are not typically comprehensive, and so there tends to be short duration, large release rate events that are relatively hard to characterize in bottom-up inventories, that start to be captured in those top-down measurements. And then the last one is there's just technical challenges that emerge with the data that we just don't have competencies for yet. And so these include kind of conditioning the data to prepare them for analysis. So for a given technology, how do you kind of determine what its probability of detection is and account for emissions below detection limits as you annualize your emissions? How do you map source categories from whatever your attribution framework has been? So whatever your categorization has been for your bottom-up inventory or top-down measurements, how do you map those to the same category so that they can be compared apples to apples? How do you develop a sampling strategy? So how much do you sample of one thing? I think you had already alluded to this, Carolyn. And then lots of things. So how do you develop an emission factor? How do you roll up your uncertainty to your overall inventory? And so on and so forth.
So is this all stuff your software does?
Yeah, this is all we've automated all of this complexity. There's like 100 pages of
That's cool.
technical documentation that you don't have to look at. It just happens.
Even better. I'm so
Yeah.
glad you put it about the materiality point. 3 years ago in particular, I used to have this conversation where people would be like, 90% of all emissions are super emitters. And I'd be like, how much
Mhm.
data do you have on emissions like below 10 kilograms per hour? And they're like, well,
Mhm.
none, but it doesn't really matter, right? And now there's more emerging research showing that a larger proportion of emissions are actually coming from smaller sources than previously thought. This is not to diminish these super emitters. Very consequential. The other thing that you kind of implied, people will hear me talk about a ton, is temporal variability, right?
Mhm.
Like there's stuff on like my charts on the board behind me, but this is a huge driver of the uncertainty. Like satellite goes over 1,500 kilograms per hour. Like how long do you assume that lasted for? And that's like a huge thing. Just random question, I guess, kind of off the beat here. I don't know the answer to this one. What about verification? Like, how does this work? And I'm going to ask this because we had one operator, they bought assets from another operator, and the emissions jumped by a factor of 3 because they found out that the previous operator was estimating the estimate, meaning they were just assuming a certain number of pneumatics by site on certain vintage sites. So, how do they go about operators in this case? Verifying this data, and what sort of efforts do they have to show? Do they need to go out to every site for level 3 and count the pieces of equipment? And how do you verify activity then?
Mhm.
Help me unpack this piece on verification.
It depends what you mean on verification by whom and for what. And so in your example for kind of M&A due diligence, we see all kinds of stuff, but I think a lot of companies haven't realized fully the business case for methane awareness, and the financial and reputational implications of not getting it right. And so, yeah, I mean, it's quite possible that if you're acquiring an asset, that the emissions from that asset are 3, 4, 10 times higher than you thought they might be if you don't do your homework before you go for it. So, but more broadly, OGMP doesn't have an audit protocol at this time, and so verification for it. And it's really important to remember that OGMP was not written as a methane accounting standard. It's written as a methane mitigation framework and basically a collaboration for oil and gas companies to get together and share experiences and get better at reporting. And so it wasn't designed around auditing and really rigorous, robust methane accounting, although it's likely going to move in that direction with some of the new EU regulations. So verification today is you submit your report and the UN looks at it and they basically grade it internally, and then they come back to you with questions, and there's typically conversations that happen with representatives, technical experts who work at the UN, and then you find some kind of compromise for what's feasible for your company at that time based on where you're producing and where you are on the staircase of OGMP. But we're moving into a world where reasonable assurance on these inventories is going to be necessary, and auditing is going to be a commonplace.
Yeah, I asked because, like, Caroline, you've worked on carbon portal closer than I have, so like you can elaborate here. But if this is like the software that we have, where effectively we take in all the different activities and sources and map them to equipment groups so that you can compare against measurement. But I guess help elaborate on this point because you've seen, and I don't want to put words in your mouth. It seems like quite a bit of this where people oftentimes are discovering what they have as it relates to activity or even piece of equipment.
Yeah, and this is what's interesting when you marry measurement data with bottom-up inventory data. It tends to point out where you have problems you didn't know that you had them before. And you made a good point, Thomas, is you find that your emissions typically are higher, but we've found that operators also find that maybe their equipment inventory on the site is not actually accurate. And we actually built a mobile application for in-field tagging, like geotagging of your equipment, because this problem seems to be so pervasive. And again, it's, when you're passing assets from operator to operator, you're managing that data differently. It just does get complex. So it's something that's fixable. And so we've developed some tools to help people with that. But it is particularly problematic when you start to look at, okay, well, where am I spending money to reduce my emissions year over year? Which most companies have those goals. So I likewise, like Will said, I love the talk about the change in composition because we've seen examples where there was a overestimate about the pneumatic reductions, thinking it would be like 75% reduction in their inventory. Ended up being only about 40% reduction when they just looked at like before and after studies using continuous monitoring devices. It's a really big difference in terms of an investment in pneumatic swaps, and they started thinking differently and putting that money elsewhere. And I'm seeing there's becoming increasingly more reliance, at least from our customers, on their own in-house inventories for making those sorts of capital expenditure decisions versus using the sum part W. And I like this because it means for OGMP 2.0, even though you say it wasn't designed to be an accounting standard, if it's helping drive towards more accurate accounting, it actually is a really useful tool beyond just a voluntary protocol.
I just will hit on that point because a lot of time people have been prioritizing equipment retrofits based on the generic estimate. And when you start measuring, you direct capital to like the highest and best use. And so measurement plays a critical role. That example that you said, the initial reaction from the operator, this is years ago, was that they got pretty upset because they said they weren't getting credit for what they paid for. I'm like, it's just reality, right? It's not as much of an
Yeah,
emissions
but they
reduction.
didn't finish the swaps though. That's the one thing. They
Yeah,
did stop and
that's
they
fair.
they
Yeah.
redeployed the capital somewhere else. Yeah.
Was
I
it like
love that you have a tool for identifying discrepancies in the inventory because you're absolutely right. That can happen, and sometimes it's just the basic data that's there's inconsistencies that need to be corrected. So we see that quite a bit. That's super useful.
One thing I'll say about Thomas is he's the great connector. I feel like you know everyone in the space, or everyone knows you. I don't know which one it is, but I say this because one of the things to try to fit into the ecosystem, academics, right? Like they play an important role.
Mhm.
They're seen as independent. How do you see them advancing some of what's going on with OGMP 2.0. There's the folks all over the place, and then there's the kind of the quasi academic groups as well. I say quasi because it's collaboration between both academia and industry. What
Mhm.
role do they play? How do you see that playing out in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a question that a lot of people are asking. So there are some really fantastic institutions in academia across North America and elsewhere right now working on some of the methane challenges. There's UT Austin, there's Stanford, there's CSU, there's even University of Calgary where I went to school, Carleton, many others. And one thing that's really really important to keep in mind is that the analogy I like to use is that in the methane accounting world, we're kind of on this ship that's adrift in the ocean, and we've left the shores of generic bottom-up inventories on this kind of conquest or expedition to go solve measurement-informed inventories, and we haven't really landed anywhere yet, and land isn't really even in sight. We know we can't go back, but we have to keep forging forward, and all of these regulations like OGMP and the voluntary initiatives like OGMP, MIQ, Veritas, and regulations now like the EU and Colorado Reg 7 are saying, well, we know these generic inventories aren't good enough, so we're just going to start requiring MIIs because even though they're not ready, because we know we have to do something. And so we're at this place now where a lot of this stuff is far from solved. And we have these academic institutions who are absolutely integral to testing things out, deploying technologies, looking at the data, running different analyses, having a really hard independent look at what we're doing and how we're doing it. and building models to help us to perform some of these analyses. There's a ton of really fantastic work going on right now around measurement informed inventories, around uncertainty, and so on and so forth, and a ton of questions that just need to be answered. But we still need to solve the problem today too. And so we're kind of doing both things at once. We're operationalizing this while we're learning what it is. So kind of building the plane as it flies. And one of the things we like to say that Highwood helps with is we kind of bring the science from the ivory tower to the oil field. And whatever state it's in today, we try to operationalize it so that companies can start using it in a way that's comprehensible and effective and understandable today. So
You use the term hard independent. I couldn't agree more. Like they are hard judges. I say this because the technology continues to like zoom ahead, and the academics likely, for very good reason, are skeptical, right? Like any sort of claims, they need to see a lot of evidence for. I mean, you mentioned the EU, right? And that's really where like OGMP 2.0 is codified into legislation. Caroline, you've seen this come up, I know, in quite a few conversations that I haven't been in. At least, how are you hearing about it, Caroline? And then I guess assess the validity of what Caroline's saying, Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm effectively hearing is that people are recognizing this is the new wave. But I think like what you mentioned, Thomas, is okay. But what does this mean, and by what date do I need to ultimately have these inventories in place? What technology does qualify? And what I heard from you, and I do want you to confirm, is that the reality is that this is evolving and it is constantly evolving. So typically when we have these conversations with folks, we always talk about like flexibility and scalability is incredibly important. That's why I love that you guys have software that's going to help them deal with like what is this very challenging reconciliation problem. And we always tell people we have the software so that you can adapt pretty quickly to a change in measurement selection. And that could be based on new approvals by OGMP 2.0. That can be based on you've actually detected a lot of your, higher frequency or higher emission event type of detections. And so you're actually looking to go for that higher temporal frequency and measurement. And so you be adaptable and have a system that helps you adapt and can manage the evolution of both the technology and the inventory itself, because it is constantly changing. So we hear that there's a lot of interest, but there's a lot of questions around, when do I need to be compliant? And like, what does that really mean for me and the inventories I need to start maintaining? So I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are.
no, I think you said it well. I completely agree that one of the things to keep in mind with the EU, or a couple of things, one is that it's final now, and so it exists, it's real, it's going to happen. There's a ton of questions around how it's going to be implemented, and there's still guidance that's needed to kind of define some of the specifics. There are ISO standards in development that have been commissioned by the Commission or directed by the Commission that are hopefully going to be kind of useful from a global perspective in terms of how do we do LDAR, how do we do MRV, how do we do bit flaring and venting reductions. But it's pretty cool that the EU has called out OGMP in regulations. I mean, whether you agree with it or not, because it is kind of the first time in methane that kind of a global voluntary initiative has been explicitly called out in regulation. And Caroline, one of the things you said earlier was kind of this challenge that operators have of multiple sets of books. This is kind of a recurring theme in conversations. What we are really pushing for, and what we have a mandate from our customers to strive for, is harmonization of these efforts, because right now there's like 5 different truths and there's 5 different ways of calculating it, and all the answers are completely different. And when your leadership comes to you and asks you which one your true emissions are, you don't actually know which one to say. And so the nice thing about the EU pointing at OGMP is that you can submit a report to OGMP, and you can submit a report to the EU, and you submit a report on your sustainability report, and maybe even to MIQ and somebody else, and all the numbers are going to be the same. Subpart W is still an outlier, so maybe the EPA will think about that if they consider adjustments to Subpart W under the new administration.
You should call them. I'm sure they're waiting. Yes, yes, yes. I guess Caroline always talks about like the measurement tech is always changing. You were mentioning that there's what did I asked if satellites count as a site level measurement. Your answer was no. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I guess what qualifies as site level measurement? What sort of detection threshold do you need? Like if it is 100 kilograms, 50 kilograms an hour, 25 kilograms an hour, is that how they think about it? Maybe that's wrong. Is it principle based, like solar radiance versus lidar? I don't know. How does, I guess, let me take a step back. How do you see measurement technology evolving? And how do you think that then changes? And I guess the thing that Caroline always says, at least to me, and I'm interested to hear if it's true in your mind, is that what is level five today may not be level 5 years from now, right? Is is that the right way to think about it? I mean, you have to upkeep your level five once you're
Mhm.
even through level five.
Yeah, these are all great questions. One of the areas that has caused some frustration with OGMP members is a lack of clarity on what constitutes an acceptable technology at what time and for what purpose. And if you look at it from UNEP's perspective, this is a really tricky situation because you have operators all over the world who have very different levels of sophistication, access to resources, and access to the actual technology. And so satellites fly everywhere, but other types of technology are startups in North America and may not be readily available. And many of these technologies, Project Canary, others are maturing, but there is a ways to go in terms of making these solutions kind of broadly accessible. So while and you had mentioned satellites, UNEP had published a memo recently, kind of urging companies to consider not using satellites and saying that they might not be appropriate. But there's conversations happening around like, well, okay, well, what do you want me to do if I have a site in Angola and there's literally no vendor in the world who's willing to go there, and I don't have access to resources? Can we use a satellite in that case, and what will that look like? And so it's not as black and white, but you're absolutely right. The technology is not only going to evolve in terms of its performance, but in terms of its commercial maturity and availability globally. And I think that's going to be really important to continue to advance the measurement capabilities of these companies in different parts of the world.
So what about those 2 points though? Like one, what it does constitute a site level measurement today? And two, like if you're level five today, does level five in 5 years potentially look completely different? Like do you have to, maintain the validity of your level five, meaning if the Overton window shifts, for lack of a better term, and now all of a sudden it's a different form of measurement technology that is required by OGMP 2.0, you need to require that instead of the flyovers, if that's what the acceptable site level measurement is today.
Mm-hmm. There isn't a very precise definition of what an acceptable site level definition is today, and that's what I think OGMP has really approached this not from a prescriptive uh, position, as in like you must have this detection level and you must have this many surveys. They've approached it more from an outcomes based and principles based perspective. And so what they want is for you to get to a point where you can make a meaningful comparison between your level 4 and your level 5 inventory. And so you could have two companies in the same basin, and one company might fly an aerial technology, for example, that has a 10 kilogram per hour detection threshold, and not find anything. And another company might fly that same technology and find tons of emissions. The company that finds a ton of emissions at 10 kilograms per hour might be able to make a meaningful comparison within kind of a statistical level of certainty, whereas the other technology, they wouldn't have anything to compare because they didn't. And so that company might be encouraged to move to a lower detection threshold so that they can actually make a meaningful comparison between their site level measurements and
That's
their
a
yeah.
great point. Great way to say it. Caroline, what do you hear companies talk about on this whole like measurement journey side in terms of like what they're implementing and thinking?
Yeah, I'm happy to share that, and then I have kind of an interesting thought based on what you shared, Thomas, and kind of curious to get your reaction. So I think on a level 5 measurement standpoint, I've heard a lot of people using flyovers, and I've also heard some using drone-based technology. I think those are probably the most common I've heard today. I certainly, and we have quite a few continuous monitors out in the field, both ours, others partners. So we get a lot of questions about continuous monitoring technology and continue to test the validity of that approach. So I'm kind of hoping to see how that progresses over time. But I think right now I'm seeing a little bit more of that snapshot measurement. That being said, I've had some interesting conversations based on some testing with flyovers that's been going on in Appalachia, and they're seeing that, hey, we're kind of having diminishing returns with the volume of flyovers we've been doing. People have been finding and fixing the leaks, and so now they're looking at, okay, I think we need to go down to something that has a greater temporal frequency, maybe to really amp up that comparison. And so what I heard you just say, Thomas, is like really what OGMP cares about is you have something meaningful to compare. So, is there a world where level 5 for a company who's getting a lot of value out of that 10 kilogram per hour flyover today may need to move on once they've really done a great job of finding and fixing those systematic problems and might need to move to different technologies? Do you think that's something the OGMP framework will support?
I would say that what you just described should be the rule, not the exception. If a company is using a certain sensitivity today that's potentially higher than where we know companies may end up, and they don't drive down their emissions over the next 5 years or 10 years, then OGMP isn't working, right? So, yeah.
This is where I was going to come back to, because you've done a really good job of being consistent on this one point. It's a mitigation program
Mm-hmm.
rather than
Correct.
just a measurement program. And I think everyone thinks about it from a measurement standpoint. One quick one for you: what is the relationship, if any, from like the voluntary certification schemes like MIQ? MIQ is great because it helps with transactability, if you will, like registry type stuff. OGMP 2.0 is at a corporate level, as far as I understand it. MIQ can be at a basin or sub basin level. Is there any relationship there? No. How do you see that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you've articulated it well. The way MIQ is designed to generate certificates for specific volumes of produced natural gas that can be transacted between the producers of that natural gas and whoever might want to buy it. OGMP is not about trading. It's not about transacting molecules. It's not about supply chain. And so this is pretty interesting because OGMP has a ton of traction, and there's 150 companies, give or take, who are participating, and we're moving into a world. And the EU import rule is a really good example of this. We're moving into a world where now producers of commodity are going to have to demonstrate attributes or characteristics about it um, at either a cargo level or at a company level or at a molecule level, not really sure, to the buyers or the importers of that natural gas or that LNG. And you kind of need something to transact on. And so right now, we don't really have an OGMP certificate. Like it doesn't really exist. Companies who are participating in OGMP, I mean, the best we have for saying they're gold standard is that UNEP said they were gold standard, but we don't know what the evaluation framework looks like. We don't know how credible it is. And so I think I don't want to say too much, but I think over the coming months and certainly over the coming year, we're going to see some shifts in this space where some of these concepts around how do we turn OGMP compliance into something that's more transactable and move it more into a methane accounting type framework as opposed to just a reporting framework. I think we're going to start to see movement in that area, and that's going to require OGMP certificates. It's going to require an auditing framework, an independent auditing framework for OGMP, where organizations like KPMG are coming in and comparing what you've done to what OGMP has asked for, and so on and so forth. So I think it's not a matter of whether, it's more a matter of when, and so TBD.
I have so many questions on spatial resolution, by the way. This is like the big. I talk to folks in the European Union. Carol and I do, both of us. at one group in particular, and they're always like talking about like, well, which site did it come from, right? And which pipe did it go into? And so, anyways, we can put a pin mark in that because I think this is the thing that a lot of people are
I
missing.
don't know.
Yeah,
The
well, it's
answer's
just
short.
me. I'll be back. I told you. So let's talk a little bit about like data quality and complexity. And I want to be respectful of your time on this Friday afternoon. I guess, Caroline, I'll start with you because I always hear you talking about level four. I always simplify it as high flow sampler. Obviously, you can use other forms of technology, but talk a little bit about that. And I think, Thomas, you'll be very equipped to talk about, statistical sampling, right? How much is enough? Obviously, I always say it depends on like how homogenous the underlying population is, if you will. And if it is, like that changes the sample size as well. But that in turn requires statistics to understand how variable the population is. So we'll get into this chicken or egg point. But Caroline, can you talk a little bit about some of the complexities that you see either in bookkeeping, measurement technologies for level four in particular, and then how you're at least hearing about the sampling approach?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the biggest thing that we hear is like the bookkeeping piece is just complex. We actually built in our Carbon Portal software. You can have as many custom forms of reporting that you want to have because this is getting so complicated, and people want to be able to compare. Wait, what if I change this emission factor? What does that do to my emissions profile? And that's why I always think it's so funny, Thomas, when you're like, it's not meant to be an accounting platform, but I think naturally in the U.S. it's like taken on that perception. So I think the record keeping for it. So you have to go out and do the measurements. You have to keep those measurements, and then hopefully you're working with someone as smart as Thomas who says, okay, how do I take those measurements and I turn them into new emission factors or new activity calculations using a form of representative sampling, which we get a lot of questions about that, and that's not our expertise. Our expertise is ultimately more on like understanding the underlying measurement and kind of helping do that like the comparison piece in an automated fashion. So it is complicated. I also hear a lot of comments from operators that say, oh, it's fine. I'm going to go out and do some source level measurements. They start to actually look at the level of effort, and they're pretty shocked because if you're going to go out with a high flow sampler, which I always think is so funny, if you don't know what that is, look it up. It looks like a leaf blower that you kind of stick over a source, and I think it's hilarious. Because we're in this world of advanced technology, and
Ghostbusters.
It does look like Ghostbusters. It's like a
yeah,
flamethrower,
that's a good
yeah.
one. Yeah, with the backpack too. But yeah, so you have to send people out in the field. You have to do these measurements. You have to go do stack testing for incomplete combustion. It takes time. It takes in-field labor, and so I find that sometimes catches people off guard. And then it's like, how do you contextualize that data? How do you save it in a set of books while also maintaining your regulatory compliance, which is a separate set of books? And that data quality is incredibly important, and it introduces a lot of data complexity that I think is underappreciated in a world where people have been managing their emissions in spreadsheets. It's just really, really hard. So I'd love to hear, Thomas. You're the expert on the representative sampling piece. I know our listeners
Yeah.
definitely want to hear your thoughts on that.
If the answer is 7.
Yes,
No.
it's six. Yes.
Yeah.
Dog ear. Yes, it's great.
I appreciate you thinking that I'm the brains behind this operation, but that the person sitting in this chair right here is Jeff Rutherford, and his R&D team is pretty fantastic. I agree with everything you've said, and the answer to the sampling question is, I mean, it's nuanced, right? It depends on how far you want to go with it. Ideally, you would have some kind of simulation where you can forecast what your uncertainty would be based on what you know about emissions in a given region or based on historical measurements, and then you can develop a sampling strategy based on that simulation. The way that it actually works is like, well, here's my budget, and here's where these crews are going, and do they have a high flow sampler or not? And okay, well, if they've got it, might as well take a few measurements. Oh, the thing broke. I guess we only got 5, or whatever, right? And so that's generally how it works in practice, and then you end up kind of working with what you've got. I did want to point out one fun fact on this topic before moving on, just to keep things interesting. And so there's kind of this irony in OGMP where you need to calculate uncertainties on your bottom-up inventory in order to compare it to the top-down estimate. And the way that OGMP or UNEP has kind of described success is if your confidence intervals overlap, then you've effectively reconciled your inventory and they match. But that kind of creates this perverse incentive to have
The
like
wider
really,
there.
really high uncertainty. And so there's kind of this like confusion around like, well, if I sample more, won't I have a harder time reconciling because I'll have higher confidence in my estimate? And so it's just kind of this funny thing that we're working through. Definitely temporary, but just wanted to point
It's
that out.
all about incentives. Yeah, no, I maintain Jeff's paper where he fused like all the top down measurements with like the bottom up approach, and there's kind of that crossover point, which is it's one of the better papers if people haven't read it out there in terms of its novelty. I'll say that it's pretty cool, and he does it
Mhm.
basin by basin, if I remember correctly. Yeah, no, I think the point on the basically what I'm hearing from you, Thomas, is it depends. It depends on literally everything on like whether the dog ate your homework or your high flow sampler broke. So, and I think like a lot of times that's not necessarily what people want to hear. So this is what baffles me. How do you systematize that? I guess this is a question just directly for you. Like, how have you been able to do that? And kind of, you have to make some sort of assumptions. I find it truly impressive that you've been able to create software to do that. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
All the secret sauce, yeah.
Yeah,
So
exactly. Ooh.
yeah, it's not overly complicated. Basically, we have more of an outcomes-based approach where you can plug in any number of measurements, and you can even plug in hypothetical measurements, and you can start to get a sense for what your uncertainty or your confidence intervals will be on your emission factors, and then on your final bottom-up inventories that are aggregated to an entire company or entire source category level for or entire asset or sort of category at an asset or however you want to slice and dice things. And so there is a table within the UNEP guidance that basically says if your asset is complex or simple, and if this is your this is your population size, then this is the sampling number. And that's it's intended as kind of general guidance, or this is how you should think about it conceptually. But we kind of use that to some extent as like a minimum compliance indication. So like here's where you should try to get to if possible. But we basically just provide the kind of uncertainty based, outcome based guidance, and then we have more sophisticated approaches using LDAR Sim, which is a separate open source software where we can actually forecast your uncertainties more so at a site level than at a source level, so that you can have a general sense of, okay, if I deploy this technology with this detection threshold at this frequency at these sites with these historical emissions, what is my uncertainty likely to be on an annualized estimate? And that's pretty useful to operators because it helps them kind of get a general sense for how much confidence they'll be able to have in their estimate when they are designing their sampling strategy.
That's super cool. And congrats again on getting that done. I want to talk a little bit about the benefits, like why people sign up for OGMP 2.0. You see quite a range of reasons, and I think what was is not what is, if you will. So some people signed up for reasons in the past that may still hold water and may not, and this will shift over time. I guess I'll
Mhm.
start with you, Caroline. Why, in your conversations with either prospective or current customers, whoever it may be, why have you seen people either be interested or undergone signing up for OGMP 2.0?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the single largest driver, which we've talked about, is those EU methane regs. And so ultimately, large gas producers that want to sell into the EU market. So I think that's always going to be a big driver when there's dollars on the line. I also find that Thomas started kind of introducing Highwood by saying we got involved and we started helping people understand like what are all these different voluntary initiatives that you could take on. What's a certification, what isn't. I find that operators are looking for something that can help them differentiate what they're doing that's in kind of an accepted framework. And so as we see the market evolve, and as you see more and more people sign up for an initiative like an OGMP 2.0, it does get other folks interested in saying, is this really the pathway for me to show to my investors, to my buyers, to track against your management bonus goals, because typically companies have sustainability goals that they're getting paid bonuses on, not all, but some. And so they're looking for, what is that kind of accepted way of calculating my emissions, really going to be. And so as you see more people sign up, I see there's like a lot more momentum. But absolutely, from a buy side standpoint, that's a big driver.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. Although I would say that the number one driver that we've seen, I could see the EU regulations being taking over as the number one driver now that the pendulum has swung away from kind of ESG and kind of towards kind of more kind of market principles based decarbonization philosophies. I could see the EU regulation becoming a bigger driver, but for existing signatories, I think it was really large institutional investors getting on the phone with executives at oil and gas companies and saying, "Hey, can you do this for me?" Or "Hey, why aren't we doing this?" And then kind of continued pressure over time kind of got these companies to start to participate. But I will say that we have customers who are following OGMP, and this is not a large number of customers, but more than one, who are following OGMP but not signed up to OGMP. And this there's a number of reasons for why they do this. One of them is really just to kind of de-risk kind of reputational risk, corporate strategy. What are our actual methane emissions? The ability to have clarity and to make better decisions, have more realistic targets, be able to better track progress, be able to better allocate resources on emissions reduction projects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of reasons why continuing to just settle for bad data is just like a really, really bad idea. And OGMP kind of gives you a framework for learning. And so an example I like to use is, you join OGMP and, you're calculating your flaring emissions and you're using the EPA factor, at least the old one, and it says you're 98% efficient. And so you say, okay, my emissions are 100 from flaring because I'm 98% emissions efficient and so on and so forth. Then you move into level 4 and you start doing, measuring kind of the destruction efficiency on your flares, and you're finding, oh, okay, it's actually 95%, which sounds like a small difference, but from a CO2e perspective is actually a really big difference. And now you have a really material shift in kind of your relative source categories and where you want to prioritize your efforts. So now in your level 4 inventory, you have a lot more emissions coming from flaring. And then the next year after that, you start doing flyovers, and you find that your flares are actually unlit 10% of the time, and the effective destruction efficiency is more like 10%. And so it's kind of this thing where like, oh, okay, I guess I wasn't properly accounting for the fact that sometimes these flares go out, and we haven't been great at reigniting them rapidly. And it's something that's relatively easy to fix that operators really want to know, and they're really, once you kind of enable them to get on top of that, it's a really, really easy way to reduce emissions quite significantly. And so the value of something like OGMP, obviously there's the value of signing up and investors seeing that. But the true value is giving operators a structure and a framework and colleagues and a system where they can start to learn more and really achieve the emissions reductions in a credible way.
There's so
Thomas,
many good examples in there. Yeah, go ahead, Karen.
well, I was going to say, I was smiling when you said some people don't sign up, but they follow the process. I actually had a meeting like last week where someone brought that up. And part of it is they said, because it isn't prescriptive, they just didn't want to be surprised. And so they wanted to go through the process with having a full understanding of like what was the cost and have a full understanding of what they would find before it was something that they needed to report on because of the uncertainty just made them feel more uncomfortable. And I think that's great. Ultimately trying to figure out what it takes to get to level 5. Like we talked about, it's an endeavor. And so spending some time to look into that before committing it makes sense.
I had somebody ask me a really interesting question last week or earlier this week, which was, if the EU requires compliance with OGMP level 5, or whatever the specific wording is, can I achieve that without signing up to OGMP? Right? So could I just do it and get it audited and prove that I complied with the requirements, but not be an OGMP member? Which I don't know the answer to that question, but it's an interesting one.
My guess would be no, because don't they review your plan? Like that's the whole.
But
Every
if there
operator.
was an audit protocol for OGMP and KPMG audited your gold standard, you could or if there's like a certificate that was developed for it that didn't involve the UN. Is that
That,
possible?
maybe, but doesn't it normally go like this? You propose a plan to OGMP, they give you edits on said plan. You go about implementing the plan. You send
Mhm.
back your results the next year. They suggest revisions to the plan that you were doing last year. So I guess
Mhm.
it's that iterative approach that would be gone in this case. And what then it would be pushing towards is kind of more of a prescriptive approach, which I'm not saying it will go there, but wasn't the general idea of OGMP to be just kind of like very flexible, inclusive framework in the first place?
That's the general idea of OGMP, but what EU ultimately wants is a credible proof that you are within a specific intensity threshold. They don't care if you're doing all this learning iterative stuff. As far as I'm concerned, they just want to know that the methane intensity of what you're producing is below what they require before they apply penalties to those imported products.
True, but there's the whole equivalency piece in there. And my
Mhm.
understanding, if there's equivalency, then OGMP is not necessarily needed, right?
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So, anyways, we can go down lots of
Yeah.
rabbit holes. One thing that I forgot to ask you, because you're mentioning it's for site level measurement. Caroline mentioned drones, and it's largely flyovers now. When do you see that changing, either from satellites, continuous monitoring, optical gas imaging cameras that fixed there around the clock on the ground? I think
Mhm.
when we were chatting before, you were saying, "Hey, I could see that changing fairly soon." Um, one, what changes it, and two, what is fairly soon?
I don't remember saying that. Although I say a lot of things, so I probably did. But I guess I will say, uh, obviously, there's going to be some kind of evolution in terms of what technology is preferred. It's a very competitive landscape. There's a ton of innovation that's happening. Every time I've tried to predict what's going to happen in even 2 years, I'm just like absurdly wrong, like way off, completely way off in every possible way. So, take everything I say with a grain of salt. But right now, what we're seeing is that US based operators in OGMP with a large number of dispersed assets prefer aerial surveys because it's a lot of ground to cover. They can team up those surveys with the regulatory requirements and streamline now with Quad OB. And a lot of them were doing those flyovers anyways because they like the data. And so that is what it is. The drone angle has been popular for a different use case, primarily offshore and large facilities. Think of LNG export terminals. These are like absolutely massive acres and acres of land that are very difficult to survey, and that you wouldn't necessarily just fly a plane just to go fly over one site. I mean, you could, and some folks do, but drones have generally been the preferred option for offshore. I think that a lot of operators are looking favorably at continuous monitoring now because of that temporal angle, and I think that it's really on continuous monitoring to continue, and I believe this is happening, to continue to demonstrate that they're able to perform emission rate estimation in a way that is useful for those evaluating the data. So I do believe we're moving in that direction, that we'll continue to move in that direction. I don't think there's any kind of technical barriers that are, laws of physics that are going to prevent us from getting there. It's just a matter of innovating and learning in that direction. And I do see satellites becoming increasingly prevalent and increasingly useful. Their detection thresholds are dropping. There's more and more of them. They're especially useful for assets that are in difficult to access parts of the world. They provide a lot of benefits in terms of using the same sensor for any part of the planet. And enabling apples to apples to comparison. So we've talked about this lots before in the past, Will, and this I completely agree with you that there's no silver bullet in terms of technology. Most of our clients use multiple different technologies. And there's no indication that they're going to stop using many different technologies because each of those technologies has one thing or a couple of things that they're really good at and a bunch of stuff that they're not that good at. And that's likely to continue to be true.
I say it all the time. It would be like if you came in and told me that the hammer's the winner of the construction site. It's like they all do something different. Okay, we're about out of time, and again, it's Friday. I have to ask a prediction question just because you said you're so good at forecasting. So it's like I got to put you on the spot. So 5 years from now, what percent of U.S. production, let's say gas, because that's what's the EU is largely focused on, is going to be OGMP 2.0 level 5?
What is it right now? Because it must be like 50% or like, because all of the majors, EQT, Exxon, Chevron, I mean, they're not all level 5 yet.
That's what I was going to. Yeah.
Conoco, so they will get to level 5, assuming none of them fail on OGMP. So, I mean, I think there's two paths. Either OGMP just completely fails and everybody quits, and we give up on ESG, or something better comes along, or we avoid a trade war. We decide to agree on some kind of harmonized method. OGMP has the most momentum. The EU is asking for it. It kind of makes sense, and then everybody does it. So I would say it's going to be all or nothing. And I would, if I had to choose a basket, I would put my eggs in the all basket, which is why we are building software for it. If it was the nothing basket, I would be on holiday, sitting on a beach somewhere, not worrying
Oh
about it.
man, there's bigger problems. Caroline, what say you?
Yeah, so I'm more in the all camp. I'm probably slightly less optimistic than Thomas though, because I don't necessarily see like 100% buy-in, which is that's just the natural way of things. You're gonna have some people that are like, this makes sense. I see a lot of value in it. I think the one question which you brought up earlier, Thomas, which I think is a really interesting one, is will the federal level subpart W start to evolve in this direction, moving towards measurement informed inventories. And that's where I think this becomes a game changer and you really get that 100%. Do I think that's going to happen in the next 5 years? I don't know. I think it'd be closer to like an 80% best case, but like I could see it moving in that direction, which would be pretty cool.
My view is that this OGMP 2.0 stuff is an on ramp to a more globalized framework. This is kind of what I was poking on this issue, Thomas, when we were talking about mitigation. You're like, yeah, the EU doesn't care. They just want to know, is this verifiable? And that's what I was poking on, the verification angle as well. To me, this is all like getting everything up and spinning for more measurement and having a little bit more flexibility. You see this flexibility as well in the new subpart W rules as well, and it starts to come out in Quad OB. It's not like OGI exactly at this frequency, and Quad OC takes that to the next level under the new administration. I'm not saying Quad OC goes through, right? But once people are exposed to the new subpart W, I think it will be hard to unring that bell, even if the new administration calls for new rulemaking. We have
Yeah, and
wasted way too much of it. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
it's quite possible that in 5 years through nobody will be compliant with OGMP 2.0 because everyone will be compliant with OGMP 7.3.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah, they'll just push an update to the cloud. Yeah, it's good on GPT-4. Yeah. Anyways, Thomas, we've wasted way too much of your time on Friday. As always, it's good. You owe me beers because we were supposed to do this in person when you're in Colorado next. As always, thank you for being the expert here, and congrats again on the launch of the software product.
Thank you so much. That was super fun. It was great chatting with you guys, and right back at you. Look forward to more great conversations and having that beer.
Awesome. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, Caroline.